When it comes to natural disasters like earthquakes and storms, governments have a history of being blamed for incompetence. With so much history and examples about how governments acted after a disaster, perhaps there is a lesson we can learn about how governments' response to a disaster should look like. First off, let's look at what the government should do after a disaster. In general terms, the government needs to take a look at the cost of an action versus the respective benefit of that action. Two examples of actions where the benefit outweighs the cost are maintaining the law and providing public goods. Although it may seem insensitive or meaningless after a disaster, the most important role for the government is to establish and enforce the rules of the game. Maintaining the law can have more positive impact on the victims of a disaster than any relief supplies could have. Having the law set in place in a disaster area can be beneficial for its people both in short term and long term. Without fear of being robbed, killed, or taken advantage of, individuals can safely make the best decision for them and their family. Recently, after an earthquake devastated the coast in Ecuador, the opposite of this was seen. People were forced to live and sleep outside of their houses because while they didn't want to live inside for fear that it might fall, they didn't want to find another shelter for fear that their house might get looted. Maintaining the law can also have positive effects on victims by allowing private companies and organizations to come in and provide relief. If an area is devastated by looting and violence, organizations are not very likely to go in and provide aid to victims. If the law is in place, however, organizations can operate with no fear of violence or looting. The role of the government is to provide public goods that form the infrastructure of a community. In a disaster, these may include functions such as search and rescue operations. Public goods are goods the private sector cannot provide because they cannot be made exclusive only to those that pay for them. An example of a public good that cannot be withheld from those who don't pay for them is national defense. A person could theoretically get away with not paying for the army, but still benefit from the defense it provides. There is no way to exempt that person from the defense the military provides. This is known as a free rider problem. The reason government needs to take care of these goods is because they can compel payments from individuals in the form of taxes. Public services like search and rescue operations could, theoretically, be made exclusive for individuals who have a subscription for that service. However, when it comes to the preservation of human lives, it is very difficult to imagine a manager or a worker withholding their service from somebody, therefore letting them die, just because they don't have a subscription to their service. Now, as to what the government should not do and why. As I mentioned before, the government should not take actions when their cost outweighs the benefit they will produce. These include actions like providing supplies to victims or rebuilding disaster-stricken communities. The very nature of government that makes it so good at managing a country is what prevents it from doing a competent job after a disaster. There are many factors that makes the government incapable of handling disasters. Its centralized nature, its lack of a feedback system, and the incentives that go along with decision-making within the government. Government agencies have difficulty providing for the people's needs because they have difficulty collecting the dispersed bits of often incomplete information from separate individuals that need materials in the wake of a disaster. In many ways, the nature of information after a disaster resembles the free market. In this analogy, consumers are victims in need of aid and supplies, and producers are those who can provide donations and relief to victims. Just like consumers in a market, the wants and needs of victims are not unified or organized, and their demands are often spread out, local, and not very articulate. Victims know what supplies they need, when they need it, and how much, but they don't know who can provide them. Producers, or relief suppliers, know what they can provide and how they can help, but they don't know where relief is required, who needs it, how much of it, and so on. The information in both sides of this exchange is chaotic and disorganized, and needs a middleman to sort through all of it and connect donations to victims. Usually, we would expect the government to be this middleman. However, Considering how much this situation resembles the free market, why should the government be the middleman? One of the reasons the free market exists is because the government is often not very capable of dealing with all of the information that comes from both producers and consumers. In the same way, the government should not be in charge of dealing with these massive amounts of critical and fragmented information. Another reason the government is often so incompetent in a disaster situation is because of the lack of feedback after any sort of action they take. Unlike the private sector, where every action has visible repercussions or benefits, the government has no system for feedback to decision makers. When a leader or official makes a choice, they have little to no way of knowing how well the choice will turn out until after it has already happened. For example, after Hurricane Katrina happened, a US government agency called FEMA spent $1.3 billion to make trailer parks for people who had been left without a home. In making the parks, however, FEMA chose locations that were isolated and far from cities. FEMA then spent more millions of dollars to get food and water to these locations, only to have them remain unused because of how far away they were. In the private sector, this massive mistake would lead to huge losses and a radical change in procedure. Since this is a government agency, however, the US government paid for these expenses and there was no significant loss for the organization. Just because government programs are intended to help victims does not mean that they will be effective. Incompetence, changes in policy, and conflicting information create uncertainty, which discourages private and commercial relief efforts. After the immediate crisis point of a disaster has passed, the human needs like food and shelter are provided. The continued supply of government provisions can actually slow down recovery. While it may be very easy to blame the government for ineptitude during a disaster, one has to realize that we cannot expect the government to take care of a job that it is not suited for. With so much evidence that the government is incapable of dealing with many of the aspects of disaster relief, we need to adjust our expectations of what the government should do. Persisting in the belief that the government should take care of functions for which they do not have the necessary knowledge, training, incentives, and mechanism does not only sets us up for disappointments, but it also prevents the government from performing the vital tasks for which they are suited for.